On the morning it all came apart for Chase Delano, he walked into a title company's conference room in his $3,000 suit, expecting to close the biggest deal of his young life, the sale of a downtown corner building to a developer for $2.4 million, and instead, he found a quiet, gray-haired barber named Gene Ackerman sitting at the table with a plain manila folder and a lawyer who did not look worried at all. Chase had spent 3 months treating Gene like an inconvenience, a stubborn old tenant to be swept out of the way of progress, a man too simple to understand real estate or real money. And now Chase was about to learn that the barber he had tried to push out of a shop he had cut hair in for 28 years held a single piece of paper that made the entire $2.4 million sale impossible. A piece of paper Chase's own late father had signed. A piece of paper Chase had never bothered to look for because it never occurred to him that a barber would know to protect himself. For 3 months, Chase Delano had done everything he could to force Gene Ackerman out of the corner shop at 3rd and Main, because Gene's lease was the one thing standing between Chase and a fortune. Chase had inherited the building from his father, and he had a developer ready to pay $2.4 million to tear the whole block down. And all he needed was to get the old barber out. He raised the rent. He sent lawyers. He let the building fall into disrepair around Gene to make him miserable. He told Gene to his face that the shop's days were numbered and that a smart man would take a little moving money and go quietly. But here is the one thing Chase Delano did not understand about the quiet barber he was trying to sweep aside. 20 years earlier, Chase's father, a decent man named Walter Delano, had made Gene Ackerman a promise, and being a decent man, he had put that promise in writing, and being a careful man, Gene had done the one thing that turned a promise into a fortress. He had recorded it. And a recorded promise does not die when the man who made it dies. It waits in the county records, patient as stone, for the day his greedy son comes looking to break it. Before we get into this, if you are new here, please take a moment to like and subscribe. It genuinely helps this channel more than you know. And while you are here, do me a favor and drop a comment telling me where in the world you are watching from and what time it is where you are. I read every one of them, and I love seeing how far these stories travel. Now let me take you back to the beginning, to a barbershop on a corner, to 2 good men who shook hands 20 years ago, and to the promise one of them left behind. Gene Ackerman had been cutting hair on the corner of 3rd and Main in a town called Keserton for as long as most people there could remember, and his father had cut hair in that same shop before him. Ackerman's barbershop was not fancy. It had 2 old chairs, a checkerboard floor, a striped pole out front that Gene's father installed in 1961, and a smell of talc and bay rum that had not changed in 60 years. It was the kind of place a boy got his first haircut sitting on a board across the arms of the chair, and got his wedding day haircut in the same seat 30 years later, and came to on a slow Tuesday just to sit and talk when his wife passed. Gene had taken over from his father at 20, and he was 46 now. And in those years he had cut the hair of 3 generations of Keserton, had heard every joy and grief the town had to offer from under his cape, and had become, without ever meaning to, one of the quiet threads that held a small town together. He had not planned to be a barber, exactly. When he was young, he had thought, the way young men do, that he might do something bigger somewhere else. But his father took sick when Gene was 20, and someone had to keep the shop. And Gene stepped behind the chair, meaning to do it just until his father recovered. And his father did not recover, and by the time the grief had passed, Gene found that the shop had become his life, and that he did not want any other. He had learned the trade from his father the old way, sweeping the floor as a boy, then lathering necks, then finally being allowed to hold the scissors, his father's big hands guiding his small ones. And every technique Gene knew was really his father's technique, passed hand to hand. When his father died, the shop was the last of him left in the world. The chairs he had bought, the pole he had installed, the very smell of the place, and Gene keeping it running was a way of keeping his father running too, a little day after day. That is what Chase Delano, with his calculator, could never have put a number on and never even thought to. To Chase it was a barbershop with an underperforming rent. To Gene it was his father's hands, still working every single day in his. You do not sell a thing like that for moving money. You do not give it up for a leaking roof and a cold winter. You hold on, quietly, and you wait. And if you are lucky and careful, a promise made 20 years ago in a barber's chair reaches forward and holds on with you. He was not a rich man and never wanted to be. He owned 2 good chairs and a set of clippers and a corner of a town's heart, and to Jean that was a fortune. If you have never lived in a town small enough to have a shop like Ackerman's, it can be hard to explain what such a place is. And Chase Delano's whole failure came from not understanding it, so let me try. Ackerman's was where the old men gathered on Saturday mornings, 4 or 5 of them, some of whom no longer needed much of a haircut at all but came anyway, to sit in the row of chairs against the wall and argue about the ball game and the weather and the way the town used to be. It was where a nervous young father brought his son for a first haircut, and Jean, without being asked, quietly saved a lock of the boy's hair in a little envelope for the mother, the way his own father had taught him. It was where the news of the town passed, the births and the deaths and the troubles, not as gossip exactly, but as the ordinary circulation of a community's blood, and Jean, standing behind the chair with his scissors, knew more about the real life of Kesserton than the mayor and the preacher combined, and kept almost all of it to himself. When a man lost his wife, he came to Jean's chair, because it was a place he could sit and be quietly cared for, without having to talk if he did not want to. Ackerman's was not a business that happened to be beloved. It was, in the truest sense, an institution, one of the small human places that a town is actually made of, and its rent on a spreadsheet told you nothing whatsoever about what it was worth. Walter Delano understood that. His son never would. The one thing Jean did not own was the building. He rented it, and for most of his life he rented it from a man named Walter Delano. And to understand this whole story, you have to understand Walter, because Walter is the reason the ending turns out the way it does. Walter Delano owned a handful of buildings in downtown Kesserton, and he was, by every account, a genuinely decent landlord, a handshake man, a man who believed that owning a piece of a town came with a responsibility to the people in it. Walter and Jean were friends, in the easy way of a good landlord and a good tenant over decades. Walter got his hair cut in Jean's chair every 3 weeks for 30 years, and Walter understood something that his son never would, which is that Ackerman's barbershop was not just a rent check. It was part of what made his downtown a downtown, and not just a row of buildings. Walter valued it. He wanted it to last. And so, one afternoon about 20 years ago, sitting in Jean's chair getting his hair cut, Walter Delano did a thing that would echo across 2 decades and undo his own son. Jean had mentioned, in passing, a worry that a lot of small tenants carry like a low-grade fever their whole lives, the worry that someday the building would sell or the rent would jump, or a new owner would push him out, and that everything he had built would vanish because he was always, in the end, just a renter. And Walter, decent Walter, thought about that, and he said, "Jean, I'm not going to let that happen to you," and Walter did not just say it. Walter, being a handshake man from a generation that still believed a promise was a real thing, went to his lawyer and had it put in writing, and he gave Jean a signed option to purchase the building. The option said that Jean, or his heirs, had the right to buy the building at a set, fair price, a price fixed to what the building was worth back then, any time he wanted, and that this right would bind not just Walter but any future owner of the property. It was Walter's way of making sure that no matter what happened to him, the barber and the barber shop would always have a floor under them. It was a good man protecting a good man, and it would have stayed nothing more than a kind gesture in a drawer, except that Jean Ackerman, quiet as he was also careful. And Jean did the one small thing that made all the difference. It is worth lingering on that afternoon, because it is the seed of everything. Jean had not asked for the option. That is important. He had only, in the ordinary way of 2 friends talking, let slip the worry that lives in every tenant's chest, the knowledge that everything he had built sat on ground that belonged to someone else and could be taken away by a signature he had no part in. And Walter, getting his neck trimmed, had gone quiet for a minute thinking, and then he had said, "You know, Jean, my father used to say a town is only as good as it is to the people who keep it running, and you've kept this corner running my whole life. It isn't right that you should lie awake over it." And a week later Walter came back, not for a haircut, but with an envelope, and in the envelope was the option, drawn up proper by his lawyer, and Walter set it on the counter by the register and said, There, now you can stop worrying. This says you can buy the place at a fair price anytime you want, and it binds whoever owns it after me. So nobody can ever run you out. Buy it or don't, that's your business. But the choice is yours now and always will be." And the two men shook hands over the counter, and that, Walter surely thought, was that a kindness done, a worry put to rest between friends. Neither of them could have dreamed that the envelope Walter set on the counter that day would one day reach out from 20 years in the past and save an entire corner of the town from Walter's own son. Gene recorded the option. On the advice of his own lawyer at the time, a sharp old country attorney, Gene took that signed option down to the county courthouse and had it recorded in the official property records, filed against the building's title, for a small fee on an ordinary afternoon 20 years ago. And then he mostly forgot about it. It went into the same drawer as his father's old clipper guards and his shop's original 1961 lease, a piece of paper representing a kind man's promise, filed away and gathering dust while life went on. For 20 years, Gene cut hair, and Walter got older, and the two men stayed friends, and neither of them ever imagined that the quiet paperwork of a good afternoon would one day be the only thing standing between a barbershop and a wrecking ball. But that is exactly what it became. Because recording that option, filing it against the title where it would bind every future owner, meant that Walter's promise was no longer just a promise between two friends. It was now attached to the building itself, part of its permanent legal skeleton, waiting quietly in the county records for anyone who ever tried to sell that building, out from under Gene Ackerman. Waiting for Chase. Walter Delano died about a year before this story truly begins, and his son Chase inherited the buildings, and Chase Delano was a very different animal from his father. Where Walter had seen a downtown full of neighbors and responsibilities, Chase saw a portfolio of underperforming assets. Chase had left Kesserton at 18, the way a certain kind of ambitious young man leaves a small town, not just to seek his fortune, but with a quiet contempt for the place that raised him, embarrassed by its smallness, its slowness, its striped poles and checkerboard floors. He had done well enough in the city, in the business of buying and flipping and maximizing, and he had come to see his father as a lovable failure, a man who had owned prime downtown real estate for 40 years and had, in Chase's view, left a fortune on the table out of pure sentimentality, charging old-fashioned rents to barbers and booksellers when he could have cleared them out and tripled his money. When Walter died and Chase came home to settle the estate, he did not come home grieving so much as auditing, walking his father's buildings with a developer's eye and a calculator, seeing not the life inside them, but the money trapped under them. He looked at Ackerman's barber shop, at the very chair his own father had sat in every 3 weeks for 30 years, and he did not feel a thing except the arithmetic of what the corner would be worth without it. That was the whole tragedy of Chase Delano, and the whole reason he lost. He had inherited his father's buildings, but not one particle of his father's understanding of what they were for, and so he never thought to wonder whether his father, that sentimental old fool, might have left a few sentimental protections behind, wired quietly into the very properties Chase was so eager to strip and sell. Chase had gone off to the city and learned the modern religion of maximizing value, and he came back to Kesserton looking at his father's handshake and loyalty way of doing business as a quaint inefficiency to be corrected. And the corner of 3rd and Main was, to Chase, the biggest inefficiency of all, because it sat on the most valuable land in downtown Kesserton, occupied by a barber shop paying a modest old-fashioned rent, when a developer was dangling $2.4 million to buy the whole block and put up something new. All Chase had to do to unlock that fortune was clear out the tenants. Most of them were easy. Gene Ackerman was not. Chase started, as men like Chase always do, with money and pressure dressed up as reason. He came into the shop, looked around at the checkerboard floor and the striped pole with barely concealed contempt, and he told Gene that the neighborhood was changing, that big things were coming, and that he wanted to help Gene transition, offering him a modest sum, a few $1,000s, to tear up his lease and vacate. Gene, in his quiet way, thanked him and said no, that he intended to keep cutting hair here as long as he was able, the way his father had. And Chase's pleasant mask slipped just a little, the way these masks always do, and he reminded Jean that leases end, and that Jean should think hard about being reasonable while there was still moving money on the table, because there might not always be. Jean just nodded and went back to sweeping. He had heard that particular music before, the sound of a powerful man being patient with someone he assumes is stupid. What struck the old men along the wall that day, the ones who witnessed it, was the difference between the two men standing in that shop. Chase, in his expensive suit and his expensive watch, talking fast and smooth about transition and opportunity and moving money, filling the room with the confident noise of a man who has never been told no and meant it. And Jean, in his barber's smock, saying almost nothing, sweeping the same floor his father swept, letting the young man's words go past him like weather. One of the old regulars said later that watching it was like watching a man in a nice car honk at a mountain. Chase left that day certain he had planted a seed of worry, certain the old barber would lie awake and come around. But Jean did not lie awake. Jean had made his peace with that shop and that chair long ago, and more than that, though he did not say it and would not for weeks yet, Jean had, in the very back of his mind, the faint memory of an envelope in a drawer, a promise from a good man that he was not yet sure he would ever need, but that sat there all the same, like a card face down on the table that only one of the two players even knew was in the deck. Chase thought he was playing against a stubborn old man with a losing hand. He did not know the old man was holding the only ace, and had been for 20 years. When the offer did not work, Chase turned to pressure, the slow, cruel kind. He raised Jean's rent as high as the lease would allow. He stopped maintaining the building so that when the roof leaked over the back sink, it stayed leaking. And when the old heat failed in January, it stayed failed for a week while Jean cut hair in his coat, and his customers shivered, and every bit of it was designed to make Jean's life so miserable that he would give up and go. Chase let the building rot around the barber on purpose, betting that discomfort would do what money could not. And it was hard. Jean was not a young man, and cutting hair in a cold shop under a leaking roof, knowing the owner was doing it to you on purpose, wears on a person. The winter was the worst of it, and it is worth telling because it shows both what Chase was willing to do and what Jean was willing to endure. The old boiler that heated the building failed in the middle of January, and Jean reported it the way a tenant is supposed to. And Chase, who was legally obligated to fix it, simply did not for 11 days. 11 days in the dead of winter. Jean brought in little electric heaters that could not begin to warm the old high-ceilinged shop, and he cut hair in his coat, his hands stiff with cold, and his old Saturday morning regulars still came, God bless them, and sat along the wall in their parkas and made a joke of it, calling it the Ackerman ice room. But Jean saw the way they shivered, and he burned with a quiet anger, not for himself, but for them, for these old men who had come to his shop their whole lives now sitting cold, because a rich young man wanted to squeeze him out. The roof over the back sink leaked whenever it rained, a brown stain spreading across the ceiling Jean's father had painted, and Jean put a bucket under it and mopped the floor and said nothing. Chase would drive by sometimes, slow in his nice car, and look in the window at the barber in his coat, checking on the progress of his cruelty, and Jean would meet his eyes through the glass and simply go back to cutting hair. Chase read that steadiness as a man close to breaking. He could not have been more wrong. Every cold day, every leak, every drive-by was not wearing Jean down. It was hardening something in him, and quietly reminding him of the envelope in the drawer, the envelope he had not yet decided to open, the envelope that Chase, in all his pressure and all his lawyers, had never once thought to go looking for. But Jean had something Chase could not understand, which was that this shop was not a business to Jean. It was his father, and his town, and his whole life. And a man will endure a great deal of cold and leaking for a thing like that. So Jean endured, and he did not complain loudly, and he did not lose his temper, and Chase mistook that quiet endurance for weakness. That was Chase's first real mistake. It was not weakness. Jean was simply not the kind of man who shows you his cards. Then Chase made his move for the money, and it was here that his arrogance truly undid him. Confident that Jean would eventually crack, and impatient for his $2.4 million, Chase signed a contract to sell the building to the developer before he had actually gotten Jean out, assuming it was only a matter of time and that a stubborn old barber was no real obstacle to a done deal. He simply never imagined that the barber had any real power. He never checked, and that failure to check, that pure contempt for the possibility that a working man might have protected himself, was the hole through which his whole fortune drained away. Because when the developer's people began, as buyers do, to examine the title of the building they were about to pay $2.4 million for, they found something recorded against it, something 20 years old, something that stopped them cold. They found Gene Ackerman's option to purchase. Word of it reached Gene before Chase even understood what had happened, because a friend of Gene's who worked at the title company quietly gave him a heads up. And Gene, that quiet, careful man, went to the drawer with his father's clipper guards and pulled out the 20-year-old paper Walter Delano had signed, and he read it again for the first time in years, and he understood what he had. And then Gene did the thing that separates the men who win these fights from the men who merely rage through them. He did not storm into Chase's office waving the paper. He did not gloat. He took that option to a good real estate lawyer, a sharp one, and he asked one simple question: "Is this still good?" And the lawyer read it and checked the recording and looked up at Gene with the particular smile of a professional who has just been handed a winning hand and said, "Gene, this is not just good. This is ironclad. It's recorded. It binds every owner, including Chase, and it gives you the right to buy this building right now at the price written here, whether Chase likes it or not." And that price, the price Walter had fixed 20 years ago out of kindness, was a small fraction of the $2.4 million Chase had been about to collect. The lawyer explained it to Gene slowly, the way you explain a great gift to a man who does not yet believe his luck. And Gene sat there in the lawyer's office, turning his cap in his hands and taking it in. The option, the lawyer said, was what is called a right that runs with the land, because it had been recorded. That recording was everything. Because Gene had filed it against the title 20 years ago, it did not matter that Walter had died, and it did not matter that Chase now owned the building, and it did not matter that Chase had never heard of it. Anyone who took ownership of that building took it subject to Gene's recorded right, whether they knew about it or not, because that is the whole reason the recording system exists, to put the world on notice. Chase had inherited the building with Gene's option already attached to it, like a lien he never knew he had, and the moment Chase tried to sell to someone else, Gene's superior right to buy first, at the old price, made a clean sale impossible. The lawyer told Gene he could do one of two things. He could sit on the option and simply use it as a shield to block any sale and force Chase to leave him alone. Or, the lawyer said, leaning forward, he could exercise it and buy the building himself right now at Walter's 20-year-old price and become the owner of the very corner Chase had been trying to take from him. Gene was quiet for a long moment, and then he asked the only question that mattered to him. He asked, "If I buy it, can I make sure the others in the building are safe too? The seamstress, the bookshop, old Pete with his watches?" And the lawyer smiled, because he understood then what kind of man he was helping. And he said, "Gene, if you own the building, they're as safe as you want to make them." And that settled it for Gene. He was not going to buy the building to get rich. He was going to buy it to do for the others what Walter had once done for him. Here is the beautiful, ironic, perfect heart of it, the thing that makes this story sing. Gene's option did not just block Chase's sale. It did something far better. Because the option gave Gene the right to buy the building himself at that old fixed kind price, it meant that Gene, the barber Chase had tried to freeze out of a leaking shop for a few $1,000s in moving money, actually held the right to purchase the entire building out from under Chase cheaply, whenever he chose. Walter Delano, 20 years ago in a barber's chair, had not just protected his friend's shop. He had, without knowing it, built the exact mechanism by which his own son's greed would be turned into his son's undoing, and by which the barber would end up owning the very building the son had tried to steal from him. Chase could not sell the building to the developer because a recorded option means no clean title, and no title company on earth will ensure that sale. And Chase could not get rid of the option because it was ironclad and recorded and binding. Chase was trapped completely by a single piece of his own father's handwriting, filed in a courthouse 2 decades before he ever came home to cash in. Gene, on his lawyer's advice, did it exactly right and calmly. He did not confront Chase. He simply, formally in writing, through his lawyer, exercised his option. He notified Chase and the record that he, Gene Ackerman, was exercising his 20-year-old recorded right to purchase the building at the price stated in the option, and there was nothing, absolutely nothing, Chase could do about it. Chase raged, of course. Chase threatened. Chase got his own lawyers, expensive city ones, to comb the option for any flaw, any technicality, any way out. There was none. You could almost feel sorry for the money Chase spent trying to break that piece of paper, except for what he had been trying to do with it. His city lawyers, who billed by the hour and had every reason to find him a loophole, went through Walter's 20-year-old option line by line, looking for a defect in how it was written, a missing signature, an ambiguity, an expiration, anything. They went through the recording, looking for some error in how it had been filed, some technicality that would let them argue it did not truly bind the title. They researched whether an option that old could somehow have lapsed, and one by one, every door they tried was one that Walter's decency and Jean's care had already closed 20 years before. The option was written cleanly, because Walter had used a real lawyer and not cut corners. It had no expiration, because Walter had wanted it to protect Jean for good. It was recorded properly, because Jean's old country attorney had known exactly what he was doing. And it bound every successor owner in plain language, because that was the entire point. Chase's expensive lawyers finally had to tell him what cheap honesty could have told him for free, that there was no way out, that his father had built the thing to be unbreakable and had succeeded, and that the Barber had every legal right to buy the building at the old price, and that fighting it further would only cost Chase more money he was going to lose anyway. A powerful man can buy a great many lawyers. He cannot buy his way out of a promise his own decent father made airtight 2 decades before, filed in a courthouse, waiting. Walter had had it drawn up properly because Walter was a decent and careful man, and Jean had recorded it properly because Jean was a careful man too, and 20 years of dust had not weakened it one bit. The developer, realizing the building could not be delivered free of Jean's superior right, walked away from the $2.4 million deal, and I am told was none too happy with Chase for wasting their time on a property he did not fully control. And Chase Delano, who had come home to turn his father's quaint loyalty into modern money, was forced instead to sell the building to a barber, at a price set 2 decades ago, watching his $2.4 million evaporate into thin air, undone by the single act of kindness his father had performed in a barber's chair, while Chase was off learning to despise exactly that kind of kindness. That is the conference room this story opened in. Chase Delano walked in expecting to close on $2.4 million, and instead he sat across the table from Jean Ackerman and Jean's lawyer, and he signed the building over to the Barber at Walter's old fixed price, because the recorded option gave him no other choice, and every expensive lawyer he had hired had told him the same thing, that he had no way out, that his father had closed every door 20 years ago. Chase's hand shook with fury when he signed. Jean, they say, was perfectly calm, the same calm he had shown through the cold and the leaking roof, because Jean had never really been worried, not since the day he found that paper in the drawer. When it was done, when the building was legally his, Jean did not gloat, and he did not say anything cutting to Chase. He simply gathered his copy of the deed into the same manila folder, and he thanked the lawyers, and he drove back to 3rd and Main, and he unlocked his shop, now his building, and he swept the checkerboard floor his father had swept before him, and he was open for business at the usual time, and old Mr. Petey came in for his usual trim, and life on the corner went on, exactly as Walter Delano had wanted it to 20 years before. And here is the part that matters more than beating Chase, the part that makes it a Walter story and not just a Chase story. Once Jean owned the building, he did the thing Walter would have done. He fixed the roof, he fixed the heat, and then he did something that made the whole town love him even more than it already did. There were other small tenants in that building, a seamstress and a little bookshop, and an old watch repairman. People Chase had also been about to evict into the street to collect his fortune, people who had been lying awake at night the same way Jean once had. And Jean, now their landlord, sat each of them down and told them, in his quiet way, the same thing Walter had once told him. He told them not to worry. He told them they had a home for as long as they wanted it, at a fair rent, from a landlord who understood that a downtown is made of people and not just square footage. Walter Delano's single act of kindness, 20 years earlier, did not just save one barbershop. It flowed through Jean and saved a whole corner of a town, a seamstress and a bookseller, and a watch repairman and the barber, all of them kept safe under the roof of a building that a good man's promise had quietly protected, across 2 decades and 1 greedy son. The seamstress, a widow named Alma, who had run her little alterations shop in that building for 30 years and had been quietly terrified of ending up on the street, cried when Jean told her she was safe and tried to hug him right there in the barber shop. And Jean, embarrassed, patted her shoulder and told her it was nothing. It was just what Walter would have done. The old watch repairman, Pete, who was nearly 80 and had nowhere else to go and had been unable to sleep for weeks with the eviction hanging over him, gripped Jean's hand with both of his and could not find the words. And the young couple who ran the little bookshop, who had poured their savings into it and been sick with fear that Chase would tear it all down, asked Jean how they could ever repay him. And Jean told them the only repayment he wanted was that someday, when they were old and settled and someone younger and poorer needed a break, they remember this and pass it on. That was the whole spirit of the thing, the spirit Walter had put into a barber's chair 20 years before, flowing forward now through Jean into a whole building full of people, and onward, Jean hoped, into a future none of them would see. Kesserton talked about it for a long time, the barber who saved the corner, but Jean always corrected them, gently, when they praised him. It wasn't me, he'd say, standing behind his chair with his scissors. It was Walter. I just kept the promise he made. And he hung Walter Delano's photograph on the wall by the door, where Walter could watch over the shop his kindness saved, and where every man who came in for a haircut would ask about it, and Jean would get to tell the story one more time of a good man and a promise and a piece of paper filed away in a courthouse against the day it would be needed. Chase Delano left Kesserton not long after. The story got around, the way stories do in a small town. The story of the rich son who came home to sell his father's downtown, out from under the people in it, and who was beaten by a barber holding a promise the father had made, and Kesserton is not a big place. And a man who has done what Chase did does not find warm welcome in the diner or the hardware store after that. He sold off the rest of his father's buildings and went back to the city, chasing bigger deals in places where no one knew what he had tried to do. And Gene Ackerman is still on the corner of 3rd and Main, in his own building now, cutting the hair of the 4th generation of Kesserton to sit in his father's chairs, under a striped pole from 1961 on a checkerboard floor. And Walter Delano's picture hangs on the wall by the door now. A good man watching over the shop, his kindness saved. There is a nice symmetry that Gene thinks about sometimes, standing at his chair on a slow afternoon. Walter Delano spent his life being told he was a fool for the way he did business, for valuing loyalty over money, for protecting a barber instead of maximizing a portfolio, and his own son came home certain that all that decency had been weakness. And in the end, it was that exact decency, that one supposedly foolish kindness, that turned out to be the most powerful force in the whole story, stronger than $2.4 million, stronger than a wrecking ball, stronger than a city full of expensive lawyers. The son thought the father was weak and tried to profit off correcting the father's weakness, and was defeated completely by the father's kindness reaching out of the grave. There is a justice in that so perfect that Gene, who is not a preaching man, sometimes has to just shake his head at it while he sweeps. The meek did inherit that particular corner of the earth, exactly the way the old book says, and they did it with a piece of paper and a good man's word and the patience to wait for the day it would be needed. So let me leave you with what a barber and a good landlord and a greedy son can teach us, and then I will let you go. The people who come to take what you have built, especially the ones with money and lawyers and contempt for anyone who works with their hands, they count on you being just a renter, just a little guy, just a stubborn obstacle with no real power, someone to be pressured and frozen out and swept aside. And most of the time they are right, because most people never do the small, quiet, unglamorous thing that turns a promise into a fortress. So do the small thing. When a good person makes you a promise that matters, get it in writing, and then when the law lets you, record it, file it, make it real and permanent and binding on everyone who comes after, because the powerful man who tries to break it someday will not think to look, will assume you were too simple to protect yourself, and will walk right into the wall you quietly built 20 years before he ever came for you. Walter Delano turned a moment of kindness in a barber's chair into an unbreakable shield, and Gene Ackerman had the quiet wisdom to record it. And together, two ordinary decent men, one of them already in his grave, beat a fortune and a wrecking ball with a single piece of paper filed in a dusty courthouse. Chase thought the barber was powerless. The barber was holding the whole building the entire time and did not even have to raise his voice. If this story meant something to you, tell me in the comments where you are watching from and what time it is there. And tell me honestly, is there a place like Ackerman's in your town, a corner that holds the whole thing together, and would a promise protect it the way Walter's did? I read every single comment and I want to hear it. Take care of yourselves, get the important promises in writing, and I will see you in the next one.